The story begins long before anyone dares to say her name, because names had a way of tightening around the throat in 1867. On the plantation, fear did not arrive suddenly. It seeped in, slow and reverent, like a prayer spoken too late. They said there was a woman among the slaves who never cried out, not when beaten, not when starved, not even when the rope kissed her neck for the first time. Silence clung to her like a second skin. Overseers avoided her path, pretending authority could not be shaken by a single, quiet woman, yet none of them would lay a hand on her. They claimed it was discipline, restraint, superstition, but in truth, something in her stillness unsettled them. When the gallows were raised and the crowd gathered, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. The rope snapped with a sound too clean to be an accident, and when her body struck the ground, the earth remembered her. That was when the plantation learned that death, when denied, does not leave empty-handed. In 1867, the plantation existed in a state of uneasy quiet, as though the land itself had learned to listen rather than speak. It was in this silence that whispers began to move, not loudly, not openly, but carried through glances, pauses, and the sudden lowering of voices when footsteps approached. The whispers were about a slave woman named Eliza, though many avoided saying her name directly, referring to her instead as the quiet one or her. No one could recall when she had first arrived, only that she had always been there, working without complaint, without visible resistance, and without the familiar signs of fear that marked everyone else. What disturbed the overseers was not defiance, but the absence of it. Eliza followed orders precisely, yet there was no submission in her eyes, only a depth that made men uneasy, as if they were being studied rather than obeyed. Overseers who prided themselves on cruelty found excuses to assign others to supervise her. Some claimed she unsettled the horses. Others said she brought bad dreams. One man swore that when he raised his hand to strike her, his arm locked in place, trembling until he dropped the whip. Among the enslaved, the whispers took on a different tone. They spoke of her as someone marked by something older than chains, someone who carried sorrow so deep it had hardened into calm. At night, when exhaustion should have claimed her, she sat awake, staring into the dark, lips barely moving as if speaking to someone who refused to answer. The plantation ran on violence, yet Eliza existed outside its usual rhythm, untouched by direct punishment, not out of mercy, but avoidance. This avoidance bred curiosity, then fear. Even the most brutal overseer hesitated near her, sensing that whatever controlled the others did not apply here. Records in the owner's ledger listed her name once, scratched thinly, then crossed out, then written again in heavier ink, as though someone had tried and failed to erase her existence. The whispers grew stronger when a stable boy claimed Eliza had known of an overseer's death before it happened, quietly setting aside her tools and sitting down moments before the man collapsed elsewhere on the property. Whether true or not, the story took root, feeding the idea that Eliza was not merely enduring the plantation but outlasting it. Fear thrives where explanations fail, and soon the overseer's refusal to touch her became an unspoken rule, enforced not by orders, but by instinct, as though every man sensed that crossing an invisible boundary would come at a cost no one was willing to pay. The morning of the execution arrived without ceremony, as if the plantation wished to pretend it was an ordinary day, though every sound carried a brittle edge. Workers were gathered not by choice but by force of habit, their eyes fixed on the gallows rising against a pale sky. Eliza stood beneath it without resistance, her hands bound, her posture straight, her face unreadable. Those who watched expected pleading, collapse, or some final eruption of fear, yet she offered none of it. When the rope was placed around her neck, it rested there as if it had always belonged, and for a moment an unsettling stillness settled over the crowd. Even the overseer hesitated, sensing something wrong not in her, but in the air itself. The signal was given, the platform dropped, and the rope snapped with a sharp, echoing crack that rang across the fields. Eliza fell hard into the mud below, her body folding at an unnatural angle, motionless enough that several onlookers turned away, convinced they had witnessed death. But then someone screamed. Her chest rose. Slowly, deliberately. Mud clung to her face, yet her eyes were open, focused, unblinking, as if she had never left the moment at all. Panic rippled outward. The overseer shouted for another rope, his voice breaking, while others backed away as though the ground around her had become dangerous. Eliza did not cry out or clutch her throat. She lay there breathing, each breath heavy and wet, the imprint of the rope already darkening her neck like a bruise drawn by a careful hand. Those closest swore they heard her inhale before she hit the ground, as though she had known the fall would not finish her. Some claimed the rope fibers were rotted, though it had been new. Others whispered that no knot could hold her. The execution was declared a failure, not out of mercy, but confusion, and Eliza was dragged aside and left to recover under guard. Yet even then, no one touched her directly. The man assigned to watch her kept his distance, flinching whenever her fingers twitched. By nightfall, the story had already transformed, growing sharper, darker, as it passed from mouth to mouth. They said the rope had recoiled on its own. They said the ground rejected her death. They said she had stared at the sky as she fell, not at the earth rushing up to meet her. Survival should have ended the spectacle, but instead it poisoned the plantation with dread. Death had been invited and refused, and the refusal lingered. Eliza rose the next day with the marks still visible, walking back to work as if nothing had occurred, while those who had watched her fall avoided her path, burdened by the knowledge that they had seen a body fail to obey its sentence and return breathing from a place it should not have escaped. What unsettled the witnesses most was not that Eliza survived the fall, but the timing of her gaze. The way her eyes seemed to defy the sequence of events everyone understood. Several people standing closest to the gallows later insisted that her eyes were already open before the rope snapped, fixed forward with an awareness that felt deliberate rather than startled. In their memory, the moment stretched unnaturally, as if time had slowed just enough to allow them to notice something they were never meant to see. As the platform dropped and the rope gave way, her expression did not change. There was no widening of the eyes, no reflexive shock, only the same calm, unbroken focus. It was as though she had accepted the fall long before gravity took her. One man claimed she was not looking at the crowd at all, but past them, toward something only she could see. Another swore her gaze followed the rope as it failed, tracking it with quiet certainty. These accounts conflicted in detail but agreed in feeling. Eliza did not react as someone surprised by survival. Among the enslaved, this detail carried weight, whispered at night in low, trembling voices. To them, eyes opening before impact meant knowledge, a knowing that crossed the boundary between intention and fate. Overseers dismissed the stories publicly, calling them hysteria, yet privately they could not shake the image. Several admitted later that they had expected her eyes to close in terror, but instead felt as if they were being watched by someone already awake to the outcome. The idea spread that Eliza had seen the rope fail before it did, that she had looked into a future moment and waited for it to arrive. This belief transformed her survival from accident into omen. It suggested that death had been anticipated and measured, not feared. For men accustomed to control, this was intolerable. The gallows had been meant to demonstrate finality, but her gaze erased it. Some claimed that when her eyes met theirs, they felt exposed, as if their own endings had briefly been reflected back at them. The memory lingered with an intensity that grew rather than faded, replaying itself whenever they closed their eyes. Even days later, the image refused to settle into the past. It hovered, alive, present, reshaping how the plantation perceived her. She was no longer simply a woman who survived an execution. She became a figure who appeared to stand ahead of events, observing them as they unfolded. That perception infected daily life. Overseers avoided catching her eyes, fearing that to be seen by her was to be measured in some unseen way. Among the slaves, her gaze became a source of both fear and fragile hope, suggesting that the future was not entirely owned by those who claimed to control it. The moment of her eyes opening before the fall became the point where doubt entered the plantation's certainty, a quiet fracture in the belief that power moved only in one direction. The overseer who had ordered the execution did not sleep that night, though he tried to convince himself that his restlessness was nothing more than anger and embarrassment. He paced his quarters, replaying the failure of the hanging again and again, blaming the rope, the workers, the wood, anything that would keep his thoughts from returning to Eliza's eyes. When he finally lay down, Exhaustion pulled him under with a violence that felt like falling. His dreams came immediately and without mercy. He saw the gallows rebuilt in darkness, the rope hanging low, swaying as if stirred by breath rather than wind. In the dream, he stepped forward to inspect it, and the noose lifted, tightening around his own neck. He woke choking, his hands clawing at empty air, his throat burning as though fibers had scraped it raw. Servants heard him shouting before dawn, his voice cracking with a terror they had never heard from him before. When they entered the room, they found him soaked in sweat, eyes wide, insisting that something had been standing over his bed. He claimed he felt fingers closing around his throat, not crushing, but testing, measuring how easily life could be interrupted. Throughout the day, his condition worsened. He refused food, snapping at anyone who approached too closely. He paced the halls muttering about breathing and knots and pressure, rubbing his neck until the skin reddened. By evening, dark marks had begun to surface along his throat, faint at first, then deepening, as though bruises were being drawn from the inside out. He collapsed shortly after sunset, gasping, his body arching in a desperate attempt to pull in air that would not come. Those present said his eyes bulged in panic, his mouth opening and closing in silence, mimicking the motion of someone hanging. He died without a visible wound, yet his neck bore the unmistakable signs of strangulation. The doctor called it a seizure, a sudden failure of the body, but no one believed him. The news spread faster than the explanation ever could. By nightfall, the plantation whispered with a new certainty. Something had followed the overseer home. Slaves spoke of balance being restored, of a rope answered by another rope. Overseers listened in silence, unwilling to argue. The death felt too precise, too symbolic to be coincidence. The man who had ordered a hanging had died as if obeying the same sentence, his body teaching a lesson no sermon could soften. Fear deepened, not as panic, but as reverence, the kind reserved for forces that did not need to announce themselves. Eliza was not seen that night, yet many claimed they heard footsteps outside the overseer's quarters long after his last breath, slow and unhurried, as though someone had stayed to ensure the lesson was complete. As fear tightened its grip on the plantation, attention turned to the records, those brittle pages meant to fix people into ownership and time. The plantation owner ordered the ledgers examined, searching for reassurance in ink and dates, believing that anything written could be controlled. It was there, among tallies of crops and births, that Eliza's presence revealed itself as something unstable. Her name appeared once in the margins, written smaller than the others, lacking a purchase price, lacking an origin. No ship manifest, no bill of sale, no transfer from another estate followed it. Then, several pages later, her name was scratched out entirely, as though someone had changed their mind, only for it to appear again farther down, rewritten in darker ink, heavier pressure, the letters pressing into the paper as if carved. Clerks who handled the book felt uneasy, one remarking that the ink seemed newer than it should have been, though the page itself was old. Another swore the letters bled slightly when touched, staining his fingers a faint gray. The inconsistencies spread beyond her name. The dates around her entries refused to align, shifting by months depending on which page was consulted. According to the book, Eliza both arrived and did not arrive, existed and vanished, owned and unclaimed. This defied the logic that underpinned the entire plantation system. To the owner, the ledger was law, proof that order existed, yet Eliza slipped through its authority. Attempts to correct the record failed. Each time her name was erased, it returned, sometimes overnight, sometimes within hours, written not in the hand of any known clerk. The plantation owner accused his staff of tricks, but none confessed, and several refused to touch the book again. Among the enslaved, this discovery carried a different meaning. They whispered that Eliza belonged to no man because no man had claimed her properly, that the earth itself had kept her instead. The ledger's refusal to hold her steady transformed her from a woman into a question, one that could not be closed. Overseers began to fear documentation itself, glancing nervously at papers, as if words could summon consequences. Eliza continued her work as before, unaffected, while the plantation's certainty unraveled around her. The record book, meant to reduce lives to property, now exposed a flaw too large to ignore. Eliza existed outside the arithmetic of ownership, written and unwritten at once, a presence the system could not fully acknowledge or erase, and that instability fed the growing belief that she was never meant to be catalogued, only endured when a new overseer arrived to replace the dead one. He came with a reputation for firmness and a confidence born of distance from the recent events. He dismissed the stories as exaggerations, superstition grown from guilt and fear, and declared that order would be restored through routine and discipline. On his first morning, he made a point of walking the fields himself, asserting authority with his presence, calling names, assigning tasks. When he reached Eliza, his certainty faltered. He stood too close before realizing it, the air around her noticeably colder despite the heat. He reached out, intending only to direct her with a touch to the shoulder, but his hand froze inches from her skin. Later, he would say it felt as though something beneath the surface was shifting, not flesh, not muscle, but motion without shape, like water under ice. The sensation crawled up his arm, forcing him to pull back sharply, his breath catching in his throat. He laughed it off in front of the others, masking the tremor in his voice, but he did not try again. Throughout the day, he found excuses to give Eliza orders from a distance, his tone harsher than necessary, as if volume could replace contact. That night, he soaked his hand in cold water, convinced it was numb, yet the chill lingered in his bones. Over the following days, the feeling returned whenever he approached her, an instinctive warning that made his skin prickle and his stomach tighten. He began to notice small details he could not explain. When she passed, insects scattered. When she paused, sounds seemed to dull, as though the world briefly listened. Once, he brushed against her sleeve by accident and felt a sudden pulse beneath the fabric, not a heartbeat, but something slower, heavier, as if the ground itself had shifted. Sleep abandoned him. He dreamed of standing in deep water, something unseen circling his legs. He grew irritable, snapping at others, overcompensating for his unease. In private, he admitted to the plantation owner that he could not bring himself to strike her or restrain her, not out of mercy, but revulsion and fear tangled together. The owner responded with anger, yet offered no solution. No one wanted to be the one to force the issue. Word spread quickly, unspoken yet understood. Eliza was not to be touched. This rule took hold without documentation, enforced by instinct rather than command. The new overseer's authority eroded each time he stepped around her rather than confronting her directly. In a place built on physical control, the inability to lay a hand on one woman signaled a fracture deeper than rebellion, suggesting that some boundaries existed beyond power, and crossing them invited consequences no one could predict. After the unspoken rule took hold, Eliza's presence began to stretch beyond the limits of where she was meant to be, unsettling the plantation in quieter, more insidious ways. At first, the reports were dismissed as mistakes born of fatigue. A stable hand claimed he had seen her standing inside the locked tack room long after nightfall, though the key had remained on the overseer's belt. A cook swore she passed Eliza in the upper hallway of the main house at dawn, carrying no tray, her feet bare against the polished floor, despite the rule that no slave was permitted there without escort. Each account alone could be explained away, yet together they formed a pattern that gnawed at the edges of certainty. Eliza was being seen in places she could not have reached, at times when she should have been elsewhere. Doors remained barred. Windows were unbroken. Yet she appeared all the same, silent and still, as if she had always belonged in those spaces. The most disturbing sightings occurred at night. Children woke screaming, insisting a woman had stood beside their beds, not touching them, only watching, her face half lit by moonlight. When questioned, they described Eliza without being prompted, down to the faint mark on her neck. Adults dismissed these claims publicly, but none could explain why the children all described the same detail. Guards posted near the barns reported seeing a figure move between the stalls without sound, vanishing when approached. Once, two men followed footprints leading from the fields to the smokehouse, only to find the prints ended at the wall, facing inward. Eliza denied nothing and explained nothing, continuing her work as if the stories did not concern her. The inability to confront her fed the unease. People began to question their own senses, wondering whether fear was inventing her presence or merely noticing it too late. The plantation's boundaries, once rigid, began to blur. Locked spaces no longer felt secure. Privacy dissolved. The idea that Eliza could appear anywhere at any time transformed her from a figure to a void into an omnipresent uncertainty. Even those who never saw her felt watched, measuring their movements, lowering their voices. The owner increased patrols, ordered lamps kept lit, yet the darkness seemed to thicken rather than retreat. The sightings continued, unaffected by precautions. Some whispered that Eliza did not move through the plantation but through something beneath it, emerging where she wished. Others believed she was never alone, that something followed her, stepping ahead of her into closed spaces. Whether these explanations were true mattered less than the effect. Control weakened as fear spread unevenly, unpredictable and constant. The plantation, once mapped and known, became a place of hidden passages and unguarded moments. Eliza's appearances did not announce threat or demand attention, yet their quiet persistence eroded the sense of order more effectively than open rebellion, teaching everyone that confinement did not always require walls, and that some presences could not be contained by locks, rules, or reason. As the sightings multiplied, another detail began to surface, one that carried a deeper, more unsettling weight than footsteps or locked doors. Those who slept near Eliza's quarters reported hearing whispers long after the plantation had fallen quiet. At first, they assumed it was ordinary prayer, the soft murmuring common among the enslaved at night. But something about the sound disturbed them. The cadence was wrong. The rhythm did not rise toward hope or fall into rest. It moved backward, syllables reversing themselves, words folding inward as if being pulled into the dark rather than offered up. Men who paused to listen felt an immediate tightening in their chest, an instinctive urge to step away. The sound seemed to cling to the air, following them even after they retreated. One woman claimed she understood a single phrase before she fled, a plea spoken as if it were a command. Others said the whispers made their ears ache, like pressure building underwater. Overseers dismissed the reports as ignorance, yet several admitted privately that they too had heard something while making late rounds. A low, deliberate murmur that did not match any language they knew. Attempts to locate the source always failed. The closer they approached, the quieter it became, until silence dropped suddenly and completely, leaving only the sound of their own breathing. Those who heard the whispers began to suffer restless sleep. Dreams came thick and heavy, filled with images of ropes unwinding, doors opening inward, mouths moving without sound. Some woke with the taste of iron on their tongues. Others found themselves repeating fragments of the murmurs without realizing it, their lips shaping unfamiliar patterns before they caught themselves. Fear deepened not through spectacle, but intimacy. The idea that something was being spoken backward suggested a turning of order, a refusal to follow the expected direction of things. Among the enslaved, the whispers were interpreted with cautious reverence. Some believed Eliza was speaking to the dead, calling to those who had been silenced, reversing the prayers that had gone unanswered. Others feared she was unmaking something, unraveling protections that kept darker forces at bay. No one dared ask her directly. She never acknowledged the sounds, never moved her lips when others claimed to hear them. Yet on mornings after the whispers were strongest, she appeared calmer, steadier, while those around her showed the strain of a night without rest. The plantation grew tense, brittle, as if held together by habit alone. Sound itself became suspect. Silence was no longer relief, but warning. Every pause invited listening, and every whisper carried the thread of meaning turned inside out, a reminder that something unseen was being spoken into existence, while everyone else slept. The decision to attempt a second execution did not come from certainty, but from desperation, a need to restore the illusion of control that had been eroding day by day. The plantation owner convinced himself that the first hanging had failed due to carelessness, that fear had exaggerated coincidence into curse. This time, there would be no room for error. Iron chains were ordered, heavy enough to resist strain, cold enough to bite into the skin. The rope was replaced with thicker hemp, tested again and again until its fibers burned the hands of those who pulled it taut. 3 knots were tied where one had been before, each cinched tight, as if repetition itself could overcome doubt. The gallows was reinforced with additional beams, the wood braced and wedged, inspected by men who avoided looking at one another. Eliza was brought forward under guard, her wrists bound in iron that clinked softly with each step. The mark on her neck had faded but not vanished, a pale reminder of the earlier failure. She did not resist. She did not speak. The crowd that gathered was smaller this time, thinned by illness, fear, and excuses. Those present stood farther back, as though distance might insulate them from consequence. The overseer read the sentence aloud, his voice shaking despite himself. When the chains were secured, they seemed almost to recoil, settling against her body with a sound that echoed too loudly in the still air. As the noose was placed, an unease spread, heavy and suffocating. The moment stretched, unbearable in its anticipation. When the platform dropped, the rope held. The chains held. For a heartbeat, relief rippled through the onlookers. Then the beam above them cracked. The sound was sharp and final, splitting the silence like bone. The reinforced wood gave way, collapsing inward, dragging the structure down in a violent cascade. Dust and splinters filled the air. Men stumbled back, shielding their faces. When the debris settled, the gallows lay in ruin, broken at its center as if struck from within. Eliza was pinned beneath part of the frame, yet she was alive. The chains had bent, not snapped, warped around her wrists like softened metal. Her breathing was steady. Her eyes were open. Panic replaced relief, raw and immediate. No one rushed to her aid. No one dared approach. The second failure crushed any remaining faith in procedure. It was no longer possible to blame rot or negligence. Something had resisted. Something had answered force with refusal. The plantation owner felt the weight of watching men's confidence drain away, replaced by a fear that no reinforcement could correct. The gallows, symbol of final authority, lay destroyed, and with it the belief that repetition could conquer what had already survived. Once the aftermath of the second hanging left the plantation in a state of disbelief and dread, a silence heavier than any that had come before. Eliza emerged from the wreckage of the gallows as if it had never harmed her, stepping lightly over splintered beams and twisted chains, her clothes smeared with dust and mud, but her body otherwise unharmed. Witnesses claimed she moved with an unnatural grace, as though the collapse had been anticipated and rehearsed in some private, unknowable way. Men who had once been confident in their power now stumbled in confusion, unable to comprehend how she could survive when everything designed to end her life had failed. The chains, bent and scarred, seemed to hold a memory of the impact, and those who dared touch them reported a chill that seeped into their bones, a cold that had no source in the winter air. The overseers, shaken from their core, refused to approach her. They muttered excuses, citing the risk of injury or contamination, but each man knew the truth. They were afraid. The idea that she had endured not once but twice, with death itself refusing her, unsettled the hierarchy that underpinned the plantation. Stories spread quickly, some exaggerated, others chillingly precise. Slaves whispered that Eliza could step through the air without meeting its resistance, that she had a claim over forces no one dared name. Fear became pervasive, seeping into daily routines. Fields were worked with quieter hands, meals eaten more slowly, conversations muted, as if any loudness might provoke her in some unknown way. Even the plantation owner, who had ordered both executions, avoided her gaze. He felt a constant pressure, a sense that he was being measured and judged by eyes that had already seen beyond the walls of the property, beyond time itself. Visitors noticed the change as well. Travelers passing through commented on the eerie calm that had settled over the place, the way shadows seemed longer, heavier, as if accommodating an invisible presence. By nightfall, no one could deny it. Eliza had become more than a woman surviving punishment. She was a force, silent and deliberate, marking the limits of control with her mere existence. Attempts to reconstruct the gallows failed repeatedly. Workers reported tools breaking, nails bending, ropes snapping even before being used. Those who tried to enforce discipline found themselves hesitant, uneasy, feeling the pull of something they could neither see nor name. The plantation's rhythms had shifted. Fear had entered the soil, entwined with the sweat and labor of every person who lived there. Eliza's survival had taught a lesson no beating, no chains, no rope could teach. That some lives resist finality, that some presences claim authority beyond law, wood, or human cruelty, and that power over the body does not always equate to power over the world it inhabits. After the second failed execution, the plantation owner's patience eroded into a mixture of anger and dread. He paced the main hall, trying to convince himself that some human error could explain the repeated failures, yet every explanation felt hollow. The presence of Eliza had grown into something unmanageable, a force that refused to be quantified, punished, or contained. He declared her cursed, not in superstition alone, but in desperation, hoping that by naming her as such he could impose order where none remained. He forbade anyone from speaking her name aloud, commanding the enslaved and overseers alike to refer to her only with vague pronouns, as though distancing language could reduce her influence. Yet the injunction itself seemed to acknowledge her power. To forbid a name is to recognize the threat embedded in its utterance. Whispers persisted, of course, filtered through fear and caution, but the spoken word now carried risk. Overseers avoided her entirely, navigating the plantation in careful, wide arcs that kept them from crossing paths. Even casual proximity caused visible unease, a stiffness in posture, a tightness in breath. Eliza, for her part, did nothing to challenge or provoke. She continued her labor as before, moving quietly, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable. It was not defiance that unsettled the overseers, but indifference paired with inevitability. She existed, and nothing they could do would alter that fact. The prohibition on her name created an air of tension that extended beyond human awareness. Doors slammed more loudly than necessary. Shadows seemed heavier, and the night itself carried a sense of watching. The plantation workers, though terrified, found themselves drawn into silent observation, noticing patterns and movements they had previously ignored. Even the owner, who issued the decree, felt its weight. To speak her name was to invite risk, to acknowledge the unnatural events that had already claimed two overseers and left a trail of unease. The instruction, intended to protect authority, instead reinforced the mystery surrounding her. It was impossible to ignore what was unspeakable. The boundaries of control had shifted. Labor continued, but the energy that once sustained discipline now faltered under an invisible tension. Every glance toward the quarters where Eliza slept carried risk. Every accidental step near her path was measured against the possibility of unseen consequence. Fear became structured, a discipline of avoidance as precise as any lash. The plantation's hierarchy, already strained by repeated failures, relied on obedience to a rule that no one could fully understand. Do not speak her name, do not touch her, and do not, in any way, challenge her presence. In the absence of explanation, superstition became law, and the law of the plantation bent around her existence, recognizing a boundary imposed not by human hand, but by something older, quieter, and resolute, a force that refused to be denied or ignored the consequences of speaking her name, or even acknowledging her too directly, became painfully clear as the plantation adjusted to the new, unspoken rules surrounding Eliza. Overseers who ignored the warning found themselves marked almost immediately, first with unease, then with physical signs that could not be explained by illness or injury. Bruises appeared along their necks, faint at first, like the imprint of rope on skin, then darkened over hours until they were unmistakable. Men tried to deny it, attributing the marks to bumps or scrapes sustained during work, yet the pattern was always the same. Hands, wrists, and throats bore the traces, precisely where hands would have gripped, where a noose would have rested. Panic spread among those who had once prided themselves on control. No one dared question the cause openly, yet each new mark reinforced the same terrifying lesson. Eliza, even in silence, demanded obedience. The physical manifestations were accompanied by other, subtler warnings. Overseers who had broken the rule reported that their movements felt heavier, their vision blurred at the edges, and a persistent pressure seemed to tighten around their chests. The marks themselves were not lethal, but the fear they induced was suffocating, an invisible authority that extended beyond touch or threat. Word of the consequences spread quickly through the enslaved population, though always carefully, as their observations were tinged with fear and awe. They learned to avoid naming her directly, to whisper about her only when necessary, and to maintain distance without drawing attention. Those who failed to heed these precautions suffered in ways more disturbing than physical bruising. Some reported hearing ropes tighten around their own necks in dreams that bled into waking hours, phantom touches that left red welts appearing without cause. The overseer's authority waned rapidly. Commands issued in proximity to Eliza were softened, delegated, or avoided entirely. Labor continued, but it was executed under the weight of invisible observation, an unspoken negotiation of proximity and speech. The plantation, which had once been governed entirely by hierarchy and violence, now operated under a different, less tangible order, one enforced by fear and observation rather than explicit punishment. The lesson became clear to all. There were boundaries no whip, no chains, and no threat could enforce. Only recognition of Eliza's presence and compliance with the unspoken rules could ensure one remained unharmed. Her silence, once thought powerless, became the most potent force on the plantation, shaping behavior, bending authority, and enforcing a kind of obedience that surpassed any conventional means, a quiet dominion that reminded everyone of the consequences that came from underestimating what could not be controlled. When the plantation's overseers reached the limits of what they could control, they attempted confinement, hoping to contain Eliza physically and curb the unrest that followed her presence. She was placed in the old smokehouse, a space long unused, its air thick with soot and the smell of charred wood, its walls narrow and suffocating. The doors were locked, and the key taken away, as though sealing her inside could erase the fear she inspired. At first, those assigned to guard the building believed success was inevitable. They stationed themselves outside, confident in the boundaries of brick and timber. Yet as night fell, the air around the smokehouse shifted. Footsteps were heard, not outside, but circling the structure itself, faint at first, almost imperceptible, yet persistent. Men peered through cracks and windows, expecting to find her trapped, yet the interior appeared empty. The sound continued, soft at first, then deliberate, pacing in rhythm with something invisible, as if she were moving within walls that should have held her entirely. Attempts to enter revealed nothing. The space remained cold, dark, silent, except for the echo of unseen footsteps. Guards reported unease, claiming that the shadows themselves seemed to bend away from the corners, creating shapes that suggested motion where there could be none. Whispers spread among the enslaved, noting that she could exist where others could not, that the smokehouse, though locked, did not confine her in the way walls and doors were meant to. Some believed she had a presence that extended beyond physical form, stepping lightly in places the eye could not follow, moving through barriers that no man could penetrate. Even the key holder felt apprehension, noticing that the lock resisted touch in a way that was inexplicable, as if the very metal remembered her absence. The phenomenon challenged everything the overseers knew about space and authority. No punishment, no enclosure, no measure of physical control could bind her. The smokehouse became a symbol, both warning and spectacle, illustrating that some forces operate outside the conventions humans impose. Workers dared not approach it alone at night, feeling the pressure of unseen eyes and the weight of movement just beyond perception. Those who attempted to confine her mentally prepared themselves for confrontation, yet each night they found themselves retreating, admitting silently that the boundaries of fear had shifted. The building, once inert and ordinary, had become a vessel for something alive, an extension of Eliza's mysterious influence. The entire plantation adapted, learning to respect invisible limits as urgently as any visible chain, recognizing that control was no longer a matter of proximity or physical restraint. Her ability to occupy space without being bound redefined authority, reminding everyone that presence can transcend walls, locks, and human expectation, and that some lives bend the rules of containment simply by existing. The escalating unease surrounding Eliza eventually drew the attention of the local preacher, a man known for his strict adherence to faith and his belief that spiritual authority could tame even the most restless souls. He arrived on the plantation with a sense of purpose, convinced that prayer and ritual could restore order, that whatever power seemed to cling to her could be banished through the righteous hand of God. At first, He approached cautiously, holding his Bible tightly, his eyes scanning for signs of both sin and danger. Eliza remained silent, her expression unreadable, as though she understood the intrusion but did not consider it a challenge. The preacher began the exorcism with familiar rites, chanting prayers and passages meant to summon divine protection and banish malevolent forces. Candles were lit, their flames trembling as though resisting the air itself, and the smell of incense filled the room, heavy and acrid. At first, nothing happened, and he pressed on, raising his voice in urgency, calling upon angels and saints. Then subtle shifts began. Shadows lengthened unnaturally across the walls, curling and twisting even as the light remained steady. A chill filled the room, cutting through layers of clothing, seeping into the preacher's bones. He tried to continue, but his voice faltered, words catching in his throat as if some invisible force refused their passage. Sweat poured down his face, his hands shook, and the Bible slipped from his grasp to the floor with a muted thud. The temperature fluctuated rapidly, from stifling warmth to biting cold, and the air seemed to pulse with a presence he could neither see nor name. Terrified, he attempted to step back, only to feel an invisible pressure against his chest, a weight that pinned him momentarily in place. The sound of whispering, low and reversed, began to fill the room, wrapping around his mind, making the familiar words of Scripture sound distorted, threatening. Panic overtook him. He stumbled toward the door, tripping over his own feet, and fled the plantation before sunrise, leaving behind candles still burning and a Bible abandoned on the floor. When morning came, the enslaved and overseers found him sitting miles away, mute, trembling, unable to recount what had occurred beyond fragments of terror and disjointed words. His failure confirmed what others had begun to suspect, that no ritual, no appeal to authority, no demonstration of spiritual or worldly power could touch Eliza. She remained silent, steady, unbroken, a presence that defied explanation, and the preacher's flight added yet another layer to the growing legend. The plantation absorbed the lesson with muted recognition, the boundaries of fear expanding to include the impossible, the unseen, and the inexplicable, as even men of faith proved incapable of challenging what had already survived death twice and refused human domination. The morning after the fire, the plantation lay in a haze of smoke and ash, a landscape transformed into jagged shadows and glowing embers. The smell of charred wood and scorched earth lingered, heavy and suffocating, and the surviving workers moved cautiously, uncertain where danger still lay. They expected to find devastation, perhaps even bodies trapped within the ruins of the old barns and sheds, but instead they found Eliza. She stood amid the ruins, untouched by flame or debris, her clothes lightly dusted with ash but otherwise immaculate. Her expression remained unreadable, calm and steady, as though she had been waiting for them to arrive, assessing the ruin around her rather than reacting to it. Whispers swept through the group instantly. Some claimed she had emerged from the heart of the fire itself, moving through the inferno without harm, while others insisted she had never entered at all, appearing only after the blaze had died down, as though summoned by the collapse. Those who approached carefully noted that the heat seemed to bend away from her, a subtle distortion in the air, and that the ash did not cling to her skin the way it did to the ground and objects around her. Workers fell silent, unable to reconcile her survival with the destruction surrounding her. The plantation owner, present but hesitant to approach, felt the weight of authority slip further from his grasp. The fire, which had threatened to consume property and labor alike, had left her untouched, signaling once more that conventional power, flames, ropes, chains, was irrelevant to her presence. Even those who had doubted earlier rumors could not deny what they saw. A woman who had survived hanging twice, whose gaze remained steady and unshaken, now emerging unscathed from a fire that should have been lethal. The phenomenon went beyond survival. It suggested mastery over elements that no human could control. Footsteps faltered as observers moved around her, uncertain whether to speak or flee, and the usual hierarchy of the plantation dissolved in the presence of her calm. The fire itself became part of her legend, a force that tested her and failed, reinforcing the notion that her existence was not subject to ordinary rules. Among the enslaved, Stories of her resilience spread with renewed intensity, forming a tapestry of awe and fear. Observers noted patterns, claiming that embers seemed to flicker away from her feet, that shadows extended differently around her form, that the air held a tension impossible to measure. She had survived death twice in execution, and now she had emerged from the consuming fire intact, demonstrating that her presence was untouchable, impervious to harm, and beyond the reach of both human and natural forces, reinforcing the growing belief that she was not simply a woman, but a force that the plantation could neither contain nor challenge. After Eliza's survival of the fire, the plantation began to unravel in ways that went beyond fear of her physical presence. Madness crept in quietly at first, infecting livestock, tools, and even the behavior of those who considered themselves in control. Animals that had once been predictable, horses, cows, pigs, became unpredictable, skittish, and aggressive in ways no overseer could explain. Horses refused to enter barns, stamping and whinnying as if sensing unseen forces. Cows wandered into fences that should have contained them, and chickens disappeared only to be found hanging from trees, their bodies dangling unnaturally as though suspended by invisible hands. These occurrences were not isolated or accidental. Patterns emerged that suggested an intelligence beyond human comprehension, a response to Eliza's mere existence. Workers who attempted to investigate often felt a deep, inexplicable dread, compelling them to retreat before discovering the source. Doors that were locked properly remained ajar when no one had entered, tools moved from place to place without explanation, and the sounds of whispering, soft, reversed, and unintelligible, echoed in the still hours of the night. Overseers tried to impose order, to account for missing animals or broken equipment with punishment or discipline, yet each effort failed. Attempts to rebuild barns, fences, and enclosures were met with immediate sabotage, often in ways no one could explain. Nails bent, wood split, rope frayed, or snapped. The cumulative effect was not destruction for destruction's sake, but a growing sense that the plantation itself had shifted, that its rules no longer applied as they once had. The human hierarchy, once absolute, eroded under the weight of unexplainable phenomena. Overseers fell ill or broke under pressure, their fear amplified by the knowledge that the inexplicable events followed no pattern except proximity to Eliza or the site she occupied. Among the enslaved, panic and superstition intertwined. Some whispered that the animals acted as her agents, responding to her will. Others claimed that the land itself had turned against the plantation, using her presence as a conduit. Even the plantation owner felt the collapse of authority keenly, unable to assert control over either his workforce or the environment, both of which seemed to obey unseen laws. The air itself felt different, thick with tension, charged as though the earth were aware and responsive. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, and the natural rhythms of day and night seemed altered, as though the plantation had entered a time that obeyed its own rules. Fear became constant, pervasive, and adaptive, shaping every action, every step, every glance. Work continued, but with hesitation, as though the humans were now subordinate to forces they could neither name nor resist. Eliza's survival had become a signal, a pivot point where order dissolved, and madness, subtle but relentless, claimed the plantation as a landscape haunted, watched, and controlled by something beyond mortal authority. By the time winter arrived, the plantation had grown into a place where ordinary rules no longer seemed to hold, and every action carried the weight of invisible scrutiny. Eliza's presence had transformed the land into a realm governed by anticipation, where fear itself shaped behavior as much as chains or whips once had. Those who worked the fields moved with caution, keeping distance not only from her, but from the spaces she had recently occupied, fearing the residue of her presence might linger like an unseen hand. Shadows cast by the low winter sun seemed longer, heavier, their angles distorted, as if the land itself were shifting subtly in response to her. Horses refused to obey commands near her, their hooves stamping in anxiety even when overseers shouted or cracked whips. Tools left unattended would be found relocated, sometimes hanging from rafters or arranged in patterns that defied reason, hinting at a deliberate intelligence guiding unseen hands. At night, the wind carried whispers, faint and backward, brushing through cracks in the buildings and across fields with a cadence that made the living shiver. Men and women alike reported dreams thick with movement, fire, and ropes, each scenario ending with the sense that something measured them, observed their actions, and adjudicated consequences without intervention. Overseers grew increasingly paranoid, consulting one another in hushed tones, yet unwilling to confront her directly or challenge the growing legend, recognizing that whatever force she embodied operated beyond physical threat. Even those far from Eliza's immediate presence could feel her influence, a subtle tightening in the chest, a shiver that ran down the spine, a sense of being watched from angles they could not perceive. The plantation's routines, once rigid and predictable, became tentative, punctuated by long pauses, careful glances, and whispered instructions. Labor continued, but it was subdued, weighted by anticipation of invisible scrutiny. The enslaved, while terrified, also recognized a peculiar protection in proximity to her. She seemed to command attention without seeking it, enforcing an order defined not by violence, but by the impossibility of harm. Animals, machinery, and even the land itself appeared to respond to her presence, yielding, bending, or pausing in ways that reinforced the growing belief that she was no ordinary human. Her silence, once simply enigmatic, now carried authority. Each movement, each glance, each unspoken step enforced a boundary that no whip, chain, or punishment could establish. By winter's close, the plantation existed under new rules, dictated by the presence of a single woman who had defied death multiple times, resisted control, and reshaped the perceptions of everyone who lived there, bending fear, obedience, and reality to a force they could neither see nor challenge, and leaving the entire estate suspended in a tense, unending awareness of what she represented. By the time word spread beyond the plantation, Eliza had become more than a figure of local fear. She had transformed into a story whispered across the county, a cautionary tale that travelers carried into neighboring lands. People spoke of her survival with hushed awe, recounting not only the failed hangings and the fire, but also the subtle impossibilities that followed, the ways her presence bent reality without a word, without a visible gesture. Those who had visited the plantation reported chills that could not be attributed to winter, shadows that shifted unnaturally, and the sense that unseen eyes tracked their every move. Merchants, clergy, and itinerant workers alike carried fragments of the story, embellishing details in ways that made her legend grow while never contradicting the core truth. She could not be touched, harmed, or constrained. Within the plantation itself, the notoriety of Eliza's survival created a profound shift in behavior and hierarchy. Overseers, already weakened by fear, found themselves hesitant to issue commands, their authority quietly eroded by the awareness that the woman they could not control had become a force the land itself seemed to respect. The enslaved watched her more closely than ever, not simply out of curiosity, but as if she were a living measure of consequence, a guide to which actions carried safety and which invited disaster. Even natural elements appeared to acknowledge her presence. Winds shifted as she passed through fields, animals reacted with instinctive caution, and shadows moved as if bending to avoid her path. The plantation became a theater of subtle power, where obedience was not enforced by whip or chain, but by an almost tactile understanding of what could and could not be challenged. Outsiders spoke of the unease that hung over the estate like a tangible mist, a sense that ordinary human authority had been supplanted by a presence both silent and commanding. Some claimed that looking directly at her was enough to inspire respect, fear, or both, a recognition that her survival had endowed her with authority beyond the physical. Stories multiplied, each retelling emphasizing her invulnerability and the failure of those who tried to impose death or discipline upon her. By the end of the year, the plantation had entered a new state of equilibrium. Work continued, life persisted, yet all were under the quiet dominion of a woman who had survived the impossible and whose mere existence reshaped every interaction. Her legend extended beyond walls, chains, and fields, a permanent imprint on the land and its people, reinforcing the belief that some forces cannot be governed by human hands, and that the measure of power is not always found in domination, but in endurance, presence, and the silent command of those who defy the world itself.